Hello, IB History Year 1 students. Well, you've gotten a little introduction to Italian nationalism and the Italian unification movement. We had to sort of cut off that story in the year 1862. In that year, Italy crowned its first king, Victor Emmanuel, and named him Padre della Patria, Father of the Fatherland. Yet there were two rather important parts of Italy which had not yet been incorporated into the Italian state, those being Venetia, in and around the city of Venice, which was still in the possession of the Austrian Empire, and also the Papal States, which surrounded the city of Rome, which were still in the possession of the Church. The acquisition of those two territories, however, did not come until later on, and they came as a result of actions that were being taken by Prussia in the process of trying to unite and create a German state, a single unified German state. So we'll come back to those, and you'll hear the story of how Italian unification was completed. But that story has to be told in conjunction with German unification. So let's talk a little bit about Germany now. So remember that Germany was a region of Europe. There were a nation of people called the Germans who spoke German and had their own unique German culture. But Germany as a state, a single unified state, did not come into existence until the year 1871. Remember that the Germanic tribes who occupied the space where the German nation lived, they practiced something called partible inheritance, in which rather than having the oldest son inherit an entire kingdom when his father, the king, died, if the father, the king, had multiple sons, the kingdom was instead divided up amongst them. And you can imagine how, after many generations of dividing and dividing and dividing, Germany became this sort of mosaic of very small and disunited states. Well, going back to the year 1356, the Germans, or at least the seven largest German kingdoms, had decided to try to bring some sort of order out of that chaos that prevailed from having Germany fragmented into so many small states by electing an emperor who would sort of be empowered to get the many German states sort of all on the same page. That was kind of the idea. Of what became known as the Holy Roman Empire. The fact is that the Holy Roman Emperor never quite achieved that level of power, and the smaller German states still largely continued to function as independent states. So take, for example, how Frederick the Wise of Saxony simply defied the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V when Charles V told him to hand over Martin Luther for prosecution, and instead Charles the Wise protected Martin Luther at Wartburg Castle. So that's a good example of how the German states, even during the time of the Holy Roman Empire, continued to function somewhat independently. So the story of German unification and of German nationalism is rather different than that of Italy. So in the case of Italy, you saw how most Italians were living under the rule of foreign governments. Italians in northern Italy living under the rule of the Austrians, Italians in southern Italy living under the rule of the Spanish, Italians in central Italy living under the rule of the Pope, which had become a French protectorate. In the case of Germany, most of the German nation, which is the Volk, the German word for nation is Volk, reminds you of folk, right? Um, Most of the German nation was living under the control of Germans. They were living under the rule of one of these many German kings who ruled one of these many German kingdoms. Some of them larger, some of them smaller, some of them tiny, the size of Franklin County. Um, so German nationalism was not so much about that. Yes, it was true that some Germans lived here in Schleswig and Holstein under the rule of Denmark. Yes, it was true that some Germans lived here in Alsace and Lorraine under the rule of France. But the fact is that most Germans lived in kingdoms that were ruled by German kings. So, German nationalism is not so much about throwing out foreign rulers so that Germans can be ruled by Germans. That's more the story of Italian nationalism and so many of the other nationalisms that we've heard about. But rather, German nationalism was about ending this condition wherein the German nation was split up, fragmented into these many small kingdoms. Because the way that German nationalists saw it, the Germans as a nation had great potential for economic power, for political power, for military power, but that was held back by the lack of being united in a single strong state. So German nationalists were not so much about getting Germans out from under the control of foreigners as they were about realizing the true and full potential of the German nation, which they believed had not been achieved because Germany was split into these many states and would not be achieved until Germany was no longer split into these many states. So, the sentiment here, wir sind ein Volk, we are one nation, here is in the context of reuniting East and West Germany after the Cold War. But the premise, wir sind ein Volk, we are one nation, we should be comprised in one state, that was really the sentiment, the mentality of German nationalists in the 19th century. And yes, some Germans would have to be liberated from foreign rule up in Denmark and over in France. But for the most part, it was all about achieving the fullest potential of the German nation through unification. The thing is, unification of the Germans into a single state was complicated. First of all, it would require somehow getting all of those many kings who were ruling over those many small kingdoms to be willing to give up their sovereignty over those kingdoms and allow those kingdoms to be absorbed into a single state. Another question was who would then lead this nation state, this German nation state? On the one hand, you had the Austrian Habsburgs, who, that is the Habsburg family, a German family who ruled the Austrian Empire. They were traditionally seen as the leaders of the Volk, the German nation. But recently, they had lost some of their credibility because of their collaboration with Napoleon. They had married off their daughter, Marie Louise, to Napoleon Bonaparte. And that sort of reduced some of their credibility. Their association with Napoleon reduced some of their credibility with German nationalists. Also, the fact that they ruled an empire that was mostly not German. That would be complicated if they would become the leaders of Germany. Would they bring their non-German empire into that role? Would the German state also include the non-German part of the Austrian Empire? So that sort of complicated the idea of having the Austrian Habsburgs lead a new unified German state. What about the Hohenzollerns of Prussia, the royal family of Prussia? They had been at one time regarded as sort of minor German princes. But the fact of the matter is that ever since 1648, when Brandenburg and Prussia were united into a single large and powerful kingdom, Prussia had been growing in economic power and military power, and they had gained great credibility by being among the first to resist Napoleon. And of course, it was the Prussian cavalry who delivered the knockout punch to Napoleon's last gasp at Waterloo. And so Prussia seemed to be the sort of up and coming German power that might provide a more appropriate, a more dynamic leader for this new German state. Perhaps this new German state would be built around Prussia rather than Austria. Well, Prussia and Austria had essentially served as co-chairs for what had been called the German Confederation. Remember that at the Congress of Vienna, the leaders of the states that had defeated Napoleon, representing the foreign ministers representing the European monarchs, they had wanted to create some sort of strong entity to the east of France to help sort of box France in the event that France went through another revolution. They had felt that the disunity of Germany had been part of what had allowed Napoleon to sort of break out into Eastern and Central Europe in the first place. The thing is that faced with the kinds of problems that I just discussed, and perhaps fearing what would happen if they did create a strong German state right in the center of Europe, the Congress of Vienna had sort of deferred that issue and had instead created what was called the German Confederation, a sort of a tight-knit alliance of the German states under the joint leadership of Prussia and Austria. In 1834, then, the German Confederation states had formed a trade union called Zollverein. Zollverein was a free trade agreement that basically allowed the German states to trade with each other without major trade barriers, tariffs in particular. It helped to eliminate tariffs between the German states. This would promote the growth of manufacturing. It would allow the German states to move their economies in a direction more like the direction that the British economy had been going for about 70 years by that time, because it would allow the free flow of the kinds of raw materials and resources that were needed for that sort of manufacturing to take place. It would promote a more dynamic economy. This was particularly true for Prussia, because Prussia possessed the longest continuous coastline of all the German states, which meant that they could receive raw materials from the other German states, process those raw materials into finished goods in their emerging factories, and then sell those to the world by accessing world markets via their ports. So it was perhaps Prussia, which was already showing the most evidence of a dynamic and growing economy. It was probably Prussia who benefited most from the Zollverein trade union and the free flow of goods and materials that it allowed. And so Prussia simply became more economically powerful, more economically dynamic. A powerful middle class now began to emerge, a middle class made up of merchants and bankers and manufacturers. And they valued talent and entrepreneurship and effort and ambition. And they began to now challenge the nobles called the Junkers. So Junkers, Junkers, they were the German nobles who had, of course, always been the most influential people in the governments of the German states. But now a middle class began to develop who, as in other places, challenged the nobles, the Junkers, for power. These middle class Germans were liberals. They were classical liberals. They, in addition to favoring free trade and a minimum amount of government interference in the economy, they valued constitutional government. They valued civil liberties, and they resisted the Carlsbad decrees that had been passed at the insistence of Clemens von Metternich, because they were seeking greater freedom of the press, greater freedom of speech, greater freedom of association, and of course, constitutional government. So Germany was dynamic in terms of its economy, its economic growth. It was dynamic in terms of its society, which was being transformed from a society being dominated by nobles to a society increasingly influenced by a middle class. The question was, could the German states transform themselves politically? Could they deliver the kind of liberal government, constitutional government that the emerging middle class was looking for? The 1848 revolution in France, which had ended France's monarchy again, and then the efforts of Young Europe, that is Giuseppe Mazzini's nationalist organization, sort of trans-European nationalist organization, triggered revolts across Europe in the spring and summer of 1848. And that included in Germany. Liberals in Germany were demanding the usual liberal things: limits on the powers of the monarchy, enshrined in a written constitution, guarantees of civil liberties, freedom of speech, freedom of press. But also, most of the liberals in Germany were also demanding universal male suffrage to elect some sort of parliament for Germany. In Berlin, these revolts, these liberal revolts, grew violent. They took the same form as the liberal revolts in Vienna, with liberals, radicals, um, rebels constructing barricades in the streets and essentially challenging King Frederick Wilhelm IV to come and get them. Well, he did, and the Prussian military successfully suppressed revolts in Berlin. But that's not to suggest that Frederick Wilhelm IV was entirely opposed to some sort of reform, perhaps even to limits on his own power as a monarchy. He was simply opposed to the approach that the rebels had taken, their defiance, their immediate leap to some sort of physical resistance, the disorder that they had caused. And so he signaled his willingness to consider reform brought about in a more orderly, respectful fashion by consenting to the election of some sort of national constitutional assembly via universal male suffrage. So the kind of thing that the liberals were demanding, universal male suffrage, constitutional government, even the unification of a German state, he consented to all those things as long as the process by which they came about was an orderly process that respected his authority. And so he consented to the election of a national constitutional assembly, if you prefer, a constitutional convention, that would be held in Frankfurt. And the Frankfurt Assembly began in May of 1848, and it continued until May of 1849. So it went a little over a year. The goal of the Frankfurt Assembly was to establish a constitution that would be a blueprint for governing a unified German state with a constitutional monarchy. So it would still be a monarchy, but it would be a monarchy with limits on its power enshrined in a written constitution. So a unified German state with a constitutional monarchy and guarantees of civil liberties. So the Frankfurt Assembly fused the principles of German nationalism and classical liberalism to try to produce a constitution that would unite the German states into a single German state with a liberal government. It did succeed during that year in creating a sort of German Bill of Rights. It was a statement of German citizenship rights that abolished feudalism and all of its associated privileges. You could tell then that this was an assembly dominated by middle class and without a lot of input by the Junkers, because it abolished feudalism and all the privileges that went with it. It established as civil rights freedom of speech, freedom of press, freedom of association, freedom of religion. In other words, a sort of First Amendment for the Germans. It had a guaranteed and specifically articulated right of privacy, something which the U.S. Constitution does not all by itself possess. And it provided for a requirement that the German government support education and the arts. In many ways, it reflected the liberal ideas of Frederick the Great, the Prussian king of the mid-18th century. hoped to deliver those kinds of enlightened ideas to all the German people. But in creating a constitution, all of the old problems surfaced again. Would Habsburg Austria be included in this German state? And if so, would it be just the Germans? Or somehow would the Habsburgs try to bring the other nations whom they ruled into it as well? And if so, what did the Germans want with that? Schleswig-Holstein and Alsace-Lorraine were these places where Germans lived under non-German rule. Would the new German state be immediately at war with Denmark and with France? Who would be the king? Would it be Prussia's Frederick Wilhelm IV? He was their first choice because of his liberal leanings. But would the Austrian Habsburgs be willing to subordinate themselves to Prussia? Good question. But perhaps most importantly, the kings who ruled all of the smaller German states of the Confederation, were they prepared to give up their kingdoms and subordinate themselves for the sake of creating a unified German state? Well, for one thing, those kings had, or princes, or whatever you want to call them, had signaled that they wouldn't, because none of them had recognized the authority of the Frankfurt Assembly. The only king who had sort of indicated support for the Frankfurt Assembly was the King of Prussia, Frederick Wilhelm IV. So the Assembly, in its work after a year, finally settled on a German state that was built around Prussia and headed by a constitutional monarch, a Hohenzollern. So they were going to offer the monarchy over this new German state. They were going to offer the rule of this German state to the Hohenzollern family of Prussia. So after creating this constitution, a delegation from the Assembly presented the constitution to Frederick Wilhelm IV, and basically offered to make him King of Germany. The problem was that because it had no support from any of the other German kings, Frederick Wilhelm rejected the constitution that was presented to him by the delegation from the Frankfurt Assembly. He complained that it reeked of the gutter because it had not come from nobles, because it had not come with the approval of the kings. It reeked of the gutter. He stated it was made of mud and clay, and that it bore the whorish odor of revolution. He was simply not prepared to essentially overturn hundreds of years of German history or traditions, or on his own claim Prussian leadership for the entire German nation. He was also opposed to the idea that since the other German kings had not accepted this constitution, that in order to build this German state, he would have to immediately go to war with other Germans. Essentially, if he wanted to lay practical claim to this German state that the Constitution had created, it seemed Prussia would have to, through force, compel the other German kings to give up their kingdoms. And in Frederick Wilhelm's view, he would then be remembered in German history as a ruler who, simply as a grab for power, had spilled the blood of other Germans, and he was not interested. So the Frankfurt Assembly disbanded. The Constitution was essentially scrapped. It became a footnote in history. And honestly, there was no real evidence of disappointment from the broader German people. Quite the opposite. They seemed reassured that Germany would continue to balance freedom and order, and that Germany had not slipped too far in the direction of liberty, that Germany had not gone too far too fast. Now, for what it's worth, Frederick Wilhelm IV was a liberal-minded Prussian, which sounds like a contradiction in terms. But as a sort of consolation prize to the liberals in Prussia, he did afterward create a Prussian constitution, not one that attempted to unite all the Germans, but a Prussian constitution which included a legislature, an elected legislature. Now, it was not elected via universal male suffrage. It was a much more narrowly elected legislature with a strict property qualification for voting. Um, but nevertheless, it was a constitution that offered an elected legislature with which he would share power, um, and it offered certain limits on his own power as well. So, as a sort of a consolation prize for Prussia's liberals, he offered them a constitution. So, Prussia now had a constitution. There would be no German state for the moment, but Prussia at least had a constitution. So, how would Germany become a unified state? They needed a leader like Camillo de Cavour. And at the moment, they didn't seem to have that leader in 1848 and 1849. Yet, among the delegates at Frankfurt, there was a man who became that leader. And his name was Otto von Bismarck. So he himself was a Prussian, and it was very clear to him why the assembly had failed. He concluded that in the end, the German state could only be built through the use of force. Only force, Bismarck concluded, would compel the smaller German states into subservience, would force the kings who ruled the smaller German states to give themselves up for the creation of a German state. Only force would do that. Only force would humble the Austrians to the point where they would have to accept Prussian dominance, leadership of a unified German state. So Otto von Bismarck came from a family that was a noble family, a family of Junkers, and as such, they served as military officers in the Prussian army. So he was very familiar with military matters. He was also highly educated and had served in various diplomatic roles. So, for example, he perhaps his most important role was as Prussia's ambassador to Russia. So he was very knowledgeable of military and diplomatic matters, and he understood the connection between military and diplomatic affairs. He was a conservative. He absolutely believed in the divine right of the monarch to rule with absolute power. Um, as a matter of principle and philosophy, he was definitely not a liberal. He embraced absolute monarchy. But given the changing society that Prussia was experiencing, he was pragmatic about the need for a parliament to sort of secure the king's legitimacy in the eyes of this increasingly influential middle class, which was liberal. So he was accepting of the creation of this parliament and the limits placed on the power of the Prussian king by this constitution that Frederick Wilhelm had created. But he was accepting of that not because he was a liberal at heart, but because he recognized that the increasingly powerful middle class did not regard divine right as a source of legitimacy. They did not regard a ruler as a legitimate ruler simply because he claimed to have been chosen by God. That was what you could expect maybe 100 years before this, but you couldn't expect that anymore. The increasingly enlightened and liberal public demanded evidence that the government was protecting their rights and that the leader of the government was willing to accept limits on his powers. And since they demanded it, Bismarck said, okay, we'll give that to them. So he was definitely not a liberal by philosophy. He was a pragmatist by philosophy. And he was, in his heart, he believed in absolute monarchy. but most importantly, he was pragmatic. Bismarck once said, "Politics is the art of the possible." And so he was willing to accept compromises in order to get what he wanted and in order to move forward toward his goals. King Frederick Wilhelm IV died, and he was succeeded by King Wilhelm I, William I. Wilhelm did not particularly trust Otto von Bismarck, but the new parliament that Wilhelm I inherited seemed to be getting out of hand. They were demanding increased power over governmental decision making. They were refusing to authorize taxation for the expansion of the Prussian military. And Wilhelm concluded that Otto von Bismarck, with his pragmatic philosophy, with his heart being set on monarchy, and with his expansive knowledge of diplomacy, decided to appoint Otto von Bismarck as his prime minister. And his first job was to sort of manage this sort of restless parliament. But of course, for Bismarck, his first job was to finish the work that the Frankfurt Assembly had failed to finish. That is, the unification of the German nation into a single state, basically governed by the Prussian monarchy. In 1862, Bismarck, in a speech to Prussia's parliament, told them, "The Germans don't look to Prussia for its liberalism. So don't fool yourselves out there," he said. "Don't think that Prussia is a leader among Germans because we're liberal." Of course, Bismarck didn't believe that. "The Germans do not look to Prussia for its liberalism, but for its power." So for Bismarck, power was the key to leadership. Prussia, he said, must concentrate its strength and hold it for a favorable moment. So the day will come when Germany will be ripe for unification under Prussian leadership. We have to concentrate our strength and prepare for that moment. But when that moment comes, he says, not through speeches and majority decisions will the great questions of that day be decided. That was the mistake. That was the error of 1848, 1849. That was the error of the Frankfurt Assembly. The Frankfurt Assembly was full of idealists, liberal idealists, nationalist idealists, who thought that if they just created a vision of a German state, the Austrians would accept it. The princes who ruled the smaller German states would accept it out of patriotic, nationalistic fervor. And you could take a vote and they would all say yes to it. But that was foolishness. Only power can force the German princes to give up their kingdoms. Only power can sort of force the Austrians to come to the heel of Prussia and accept Prussian leadership over a German state and over the German nation. So, not by speeches and majority decisions will the great questions of the day be decided, but by iron and blood, which was Bismarck's way of saying war. Only through force could the new German state be created. So, uh, so here's the thing. Otto von Bismarck was a practitioner of what is called Realpolitik. That's the German word for it. Realpolitik. There's that speech, by the way. Realpolitik. 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 It means realistic politics. And that goes by many names. In France, that's called raison d'etat. In English, it's simply called realism. In realistic politics, or realpolitik, or raison d'etat, you say, look, when the state is making decisions, the interests of the state must be the most influential factor in decision making, not moral concerns or ethical considerations. One of the earliest practitioners of this raison d'etat was the Cardinal Richelieu of France, who once said that the state has no immortal soul. Therefore, the state doesn't have to concern itself with the disposition of its soul in the afterlife. The state doesn't have to make God happy, Richelieu said. For the state, salvation doesn't come in the hereafter. It's here and now. So the state has to do what it's got to do to get what it needs to survive and to advance and to become more powerful. And Bismarck believed that as well. War, for example, which might be morally or ethically objectionable to some, was, he believed, a legitimate instrument of policy. That there was nothing wrong with the state going to war if it was for the right purpose. For Otto von Bismarck, there was nothing wrong with going to war if, number one, there was a clearly defined goal for fighting the war. There had to be a clearly defined goal. And number two, that goal had to be aligned with a particularly important state interest, a clearly defined state interest. Because he said, when you have a clearly defined goal that is aligned with the interests of the state, that's how you know when to stop fighting. When you've accomplished the goal, that's when the war's over. I think that Bismarck's critique of Napoleon Bonaparte, Napoleon the Emperor of France, was that he never knew when to stop fighting. He didn't seem to have a clearly defined goal that let him know when it was time to stop. For Bismarck, having that goal was very clear. So for Bismarck, war is a legitimate instrument of policy, so long as it is entered into with a clearly defined goal that is aligned with the interests of the state. War, on the other hand, should never be engaged in for foolish reasons. So those who then concluded that Bismarck, and he's critiqued this way by some today, that he's some sort of warmonger, it's not true. He did not glory in war. He did not believe that war should be fought in pursuit of glory or for other foolish reasons, like pride or revenge or anger. There was no justification for war on an emotional basis because, he said, when you go into a war out of emotion, you are going in out of a reaction to something. It's your reaction, and therefore you are not prepared. And when you go into war unprepared, you lose. And that is a waste of human life, and that is morally objectionable. Another thing about, so Bismarck believed that war was necessary to create this German state. The clearly definable goal was the unification of the German states into a single German state. He believed that that was very much in the best interest of the German nation. And so he was prepared to go to war, repeatedly if necessary. Unlike Frederick Wilhelm IV had been, he was prepared to go to war in order to build Germany. In the meantime, though, he also understood the concept of the balance of power. He knew that if he moved too quickly to consolidate Germany under Prussian leadership, that would trigger resistance from European states. Remember the way that the balance of power works. The idea of the balance of power is that whenever one state becomes so powerful that by its very existence it appears to be a threat to the security of its neighbors will then unite into an alliance to bring the power back into balance and to thwart the ambitions of that very powerful state. Bismarck was very aware that this could happen to Germany if he moved too swiftly, too aggressively, if in his efforts to unite the German state, he intimidated or threatened his neighbors, the other states of Europe, they would align against Prussia and block Prussia from fulfilling the unification of Germany. So he knew that while on the one hand he was prepared to be aggressive and fight wars to achieve this goal, He had to be careful about how he did it. He had to be judicious about how he did it. He knew that he must, as often as possible, prevent Prussia from being seen as some sort of reckless, intimidating, threatening aggressor state. So Otto von Bismarck was a thoughtful and careful strategist. And it was through his efforts that the German state was unified, and indirectly through his efforts that the Italian state completed its unification as well. Those stories, however, are for another day. So, take care of yourselves, be healthy, be safe, and we'll look forward to teaching you that lesson soon. Bye-bye, everyone.